Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Kurdistan Connection here on Media News with myself, Matt Broomfield. And hello to regular viewers. You join us at what I'm sure you all know is an extremely, I don't want to say exciting, an extremely eventful period in what's been an extremely eventful year in the Middle East in particular, in the world in general. And this week, of course, everyone's attention is turning at least partially to the United States, where the presidential election between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris is going to take place. There's a lot to consider, of course, in this election. Here at Media News, we're wondering about what's going to happen for the Kurdish people in particular, and in those countries where the Kurdish people live. What would a Trump election mean in Erdogan's Turkey? What will it mean for broader US policy in the region? And of course, that's also very connected to American policy in Israel and Gaza. So there's a lot to unpack. I'm glad to have our guest with us to discuss this today, Aidan Simardone. Aidan, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So Aidan is an immigration and human rights lawyer based in Toronto, Canada. He's also a writer. I've come across some of Aidan's work on the region, and I guess particularly looking at Turkish policy and how it might fit into the American and global strategy and interests in the region or not. Aidan, thank you for joining us today and for your important work in various fields. Why I wanted to invite you on today was I saw this report that you made about President Erdogan and Turkey's relationship to Israel and to Gaza. So perhaps before we get into the Western policy side, you could just explain a bit what motivated you to write that article and what were you trying to communicate?
Yeah, I believe the one you're talking about is the one from January, talking about how Erdogan is no friend to Palestine. And what motivated me to write that was actually because I think what Erdogan says and what Erdogan does are two completely different things. So Erdogan says he is a friend of Palestinians. He actually says some quite bold things, especially recently. He's compared Israel to Nazi Germany and has even gone as far as suggesting that Turkey is going to engage in a military intervention to protect Palestinians in Gaza. Which I actually agree with all that, and it would be great if he did that. The thing is, though, Turkey continues to actually covertly maintain relations with Israel through trade. And so, as I wrote in the article, in fact, Turkey even kind of the inner circle of Erdogan's family, a lot of them own shipping companies, etc., that are actually directly benefiting from the trade that is continuing to happen with Israel. So, when we find these contradictions, they need to be exposed, and we need to be kind of aware of what we're really dealing with. And in writing this article, I hope that people can now see through Erdogan's tactics, to say the least.
Sure. So you've mentioned Erdogan's tactics, in terms of keeping up a kind of maybe a bluster, a front, and indeed implementing some policies which do restrict some trade with Israel, but also keeping up this covert trade. How does that maybe fit into Erdogan's broader strategy? What's his kind of vision, do you think, for Turkey's role in the Middle East, and how does all this fit into it?
Yeah, I think really Erdogan does whatever strengthens Erdogan. That's really honestly the answer to that. He's one of these demagogues that says very bold, nice things, then does other things that secures his power. So kind of going back to what I was saying, I think really his goal is just to increase power. I don't think he's actually pro-Palestinian. And as I wrote in this article, he's been in power for a long time, and we continuously, for decades, this is exactly what Erdogan does. I'm going to go through it. This is what he does. He tries to maintain cozy relations with Israel when things are, quote unquote, a little more calm, when there aren't these giant massacres like we're seeing right now, when it's just quote unquote regular apartheid. When Israel's not as much in the news, you see Erdogan trying to actually cozy up. So, for instance, there used to actually be a free trade agreement between Turkey and Israel. Turkey, for instance, before the Arab Spring, was actually trying to get, under Erdogan's leadership, was trying to get Syria and Israel to reach a peace agreement. So it's very clear that Erdogan is not actually pro-Palestinian. If anything, he just goes where the power is, and the power is in Israel at the moment. Then what happens is when there's these giant controversies. So we all remember back in 2010, there was the flotilla that came from, I believe, Turkey, and there was many Turkish nationals. This was a flotilla that was going to bring aid to Gaza. The Israeli occupation forces boarded it, killed a bunch of these people, and it became a whole diplomatic controversy. Turkey, of course, and under Erdogan's leadership, makes a big thing about this, which, I mean, that's fair. You definitely should make a big thing about that, but only in the words, because what ended up happening was they broke off diplomatic relations, and they condemned Israel. But then very soon after, they were just buddy again, trading and getting along like usual, right? And unfortunately, Erdogan's not unique in this. This is kind of like a broader thing in the Middle East. We see it with Arab countries, etc. So going back to your point, though, Erdogan is going to pursue power no matter what. And the only way to stop that is to fight back, which a lot of people I know in Turkey are doing.
Sure. And what? Well, let's first of all. So, why does this matter for the Palestinian people? So, if there are there are people suffering now in Gaza, even if Erdogan is just, even if it's somewhat performative, even if it's somewhat cynical, at least it's helping them, right? Would be the argument to some degree. Is there a way in which this is detrimental to the Palestinian cause?
It is, and you make a good point, but I'd actually say it is detrimental. And the reason why it's so, for your viewers, like for me, for instance, like one of my favorite political theorists, and I call him a political theorist, is actually Malcolm X. And Malcolm X says, when you're dealing with, when you're dealing with a wolf, you're dealing with a wolf. A wolf is very clear. You see in the forest, and it's going to attack you. A fox is trickier because I digress, but here's my analogy. A fox is sneaky. A fox pretends to be tries to be all cuddly and nice, but it will try to eat you anyways. And so what Erdogan does is actually, I think, in a certain way, a little more dangerous, because he pretends to be the friend of Palestinians. And in doing so, he gives the impression that Turkey is on the side of Palestine. In a weird way, it would actually be better if he was quite blunt and just said he didn't care, because then that would actually lead to more action against him. Thankfully, some people are seeing through that. So your viewers might be aware of this. There was actually, I think this week, maybe it was in Istanbul or another port, there was actually pro-Palestinian Turkish people who were actually protesting against shipments that were heading towards Israel. But I actually don't think it's good, because, frankly, what Palestinians need, they don't need words of encouragement. They have enough encouragement. We see the resistance. They're putting up a good fight. What they need is a change in the material circumstances. So words are kind of meaningless at this point. What really matters is the material circumstances, and the material circumstances are that Turkey continues to actually trade with Israel. Now, one quick caveat, by the way, I'll just bring this up, because today actually there was an announcement that they're going to try close some of the loopholes, because what's happening right now is that Turkey continues to trade with Israel through third countries. And so the Turkish government might close some of these loopholes, but I'd say that would only happen because of the pressure from people in Turkey and across the Middle East. Erdogan is never going to do this himself. It's going to take bottom-up pressure for things to change.
Absolutely. So maybe let's turn now to think a little bit more from a Western perspective. When I say this, I'm thinking particularly of the US election, but also for people in Canada, also for people in the UK, where I am, European countries. Why should the public care about Erdogan's actions in this conflict? Are there, from a Western perspective, does it harm us? Why should we care what Erdogan's doing, whether Erdogan is trading with Israel or not?
I mean, I think we should care if we care about other people. Like,
Sure.
It's a good question. It's a really, really good. It's a good question. I think if we show solidarity with Palestinians, then we should care about what Turkey for a long time has actually been one of Israel's top trading partners.
Yeah.
A lot of Turkey's exports are actually in pretty critical materials. So steel actually remains a big export that Turkey does send to Israel. Some of this steel might be used for manufacturing military equipment, and it also is a raw material that's literally used by Israeli settlers to build their settlements on Palestinian land. So that's why it should matter. I think also in the broader context, I mean, why is what Erdogan do matter? I think it matters because we need to see through the lies. You know, like it's very easy if you're not aware of what Erdogan actually does, what he says sounds great. Like it sounds awesome. I'm like, yes, Israel is like Nazi Germany. Yes, there should be a military intervention to help protect Palestinians because there is a genocide going on. Yes, awesome. He's not doing any of that though, and that has to be really clear. And if you actually look up, and I just want to make one quick point, and because this is quite big, people do think he's doing something. So I've done a lot of articles on Turkey, and when you go onto YouTube, sometimes a great resource because you can get good academic lectures, analysis, etc. But when you just search like something like Turkey Israel really quickly on YouTube, there's all these clickbait videos that say Turkey is like fighting back against Israel, and Turkey is going to go to war to protect Palestinians. None of this is true. None of it's a lie, and so we need to see through that. So I think for our own cognitive sake and for being aware, and if we just care about people, that's why the West should care. Now, beyond Palestine, there's also a bunch of other things about Turkey that I'd be happy to get into that are also important, of course. So, yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so by this question, I didn't mean to imply the question of why people in the West should care at all, but given that Gaza is a huge issue in the US election, that it's become a bigger issue than maybe ever before throughout the West. What are sort of why should people be thinking about these other questions? What's the position of Turkey in this conflict? What position also of other regional capitals?
Well, Turkey, as we know, unfortunately, is actually a big player in the Middle East. Everywhere from Libya to Iraq to Azerbaijan. It's really Turkey is essential. You can't understand the Middle East without Turkey, and I think that's why the Westerners should care about what Erdogan does. To keep it brief.
Sure. So let's turn now to what I suppose will be this evening's election by the time this is published. So yeah, as we've said, there are a lot of people in America who are concerned about what's happening in the Middle East, particularly about Gaza, of course, and also about the wider regional confrontation. Perhaps you could say a few words. Maybe we can take them one by one. So let's say Donald Trump gets in. What's going to change in the Middle East, and particularly with an eye to the US-Turkish relation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's kind of funny talking about Trump versus Harris because I find actually often their foreign policy, despite their rhetoric, is quite similar. There are some key differences, and we'll get into that. I think Trump is a very interesting case because we see some mixed things. So, for instance, actually in 2017, there was, even though Trump is supposedly pro-Russian, there was these sanctions against Russian military equipment, and that actually ended up affecting Turkey because Turkey trades with Russia. So that's quite interesting. So that happened under Trump. Another thing, though, regarding that is one of the few policy differences between Harris and Trump is Trump, and this is going to matter to what I'm going to say, Trump is obviously actually quite against the idea of continuing to support Ukraine in the ongoing war. And the reason why I think this matters with Turkey is because Turkey does seem to have some interest in possibly cozying up to Russia. I think if Trump takes the lead and actually decides to bring a ceasefire in Ukraine, I don't think that's going to happen, but should it happen, you might see a détente, a sort of calming of tensions between the West and Russia. Again, this is all very hypothetical because actually only 1 year after Trump was elected, actually, there was already sanctions on Russian military equipment. So Trump might say he's pro-Putin, or people might say Trump's pro-Putin, but that's not necessarily the case. And one more thing also, I think also that's critical about Trump, and again, because everything's hypothetical, so we kind of have to rely on his previous presidency.
Sure.
There did seem to be a lot of paranoia, to put it frankly, in the administration regarding the Gulen movement. I remember the Trump administration was almost very anti-Gulen. I don't know, for some reason. I remember, I think it was Flynn was even proposing to extradite Gulen, if I'm correct, back to Turkey or something like that.
Yeah,
very strange.
People were receiving money as well in the Trump administration to lobby against Gulen, at least.
Yeah, so that might be another thing. The only other thing and we also saw, for instance, I'm just kind of going off the top of my head, but we also did see, for instance, on the pro-Turkish side of Trump, obviously the withdrawal of U.S. troops along the border in Syria, which obviously ended up really affecting the Syrian Democratic Forces. So I mean, it's kind of mixed, So on the one hand, as I said, there was these sanctions that ended up affecting Turkey vis-a-vis Russia, but on the other hand, unfortunately, Trump seems to be quite pro, or at least willing to let Turkey do whatever it wants. So that's might be the result again should he win.
Sure. And yeah, kind of as you suggested at the start of the call, I've also been speaking with some Kurdish officials in the last week, and some other analysts who have also sort of reflected your first statement that quite possibly not that there won't be that much between the two candidates' policy in the Middle East in general, also particularly regarding Turkey, Kurds. Would you think that's a fair assessment?
I think it's a fair assessment. I think with look at Harris, for instance, the Biden-Harris administration, for instance. So on the one hand, we had the expansion of NATO, right? So we're all familiar with that. Sweden and Finland joined. As your viewers know, there is a big Kurdish population in Sweden. Part of the reason why Sweden was able to join NATO was because of a agreement with Turkey to, quote unquote, I'm putting air quotes around this, to if Sweden agrees to extradite potential terrorists. I'd call them freedom fighters, but that's the language they use in the agreement. This is obviously this obviously affected Kurds in Sweden, for instance, right? We see, for instance, Turkey conducting airstrikes across Syria. And this is happening during the Biden-Harris administration, right? So I don't think there's actually a significant foreign policy difference between the two candidates. On this note, I do want to say something, because that sounds depressing, but I actually think in a weird way what that tells us, if there's no difference between their foreign policy, where does change come from? Change comes from the bottom. It comes from the grassroots, things like that. Remember, the Vietnam War ended under Nixon. Nixon was considered this ultra-right conservative who would never ended the war. And it was because of the mass protests that happened, right? It was because of mass movements that actually, under Trump's presidency, there were fewer deportations than under Biden or Obama, not because Trump was a good guy, but because people came out in the millions. So what am I trying to say with this? And what I'm trying to say is, if they're both the same, and if change should happen, it'll come from the bottom up. And I do hope that does happen, and keep fighting back, because, it looks like nothing can change until it does, of course.
Sure. Yeah, that's good. Certainly, a good point to bear in mind, particularly as we go into what will be the carnival of the coming hours.
Oh, fun!
In America. But perhaps though, let's just as a sort of final question: are there concrete steps concrete changes that an incoming US administration could put into place in terms of its relationship with Turkey? Are there ways that they could exert, or could, or should exert more pressure on Turkey to stand up for rights in the Middle East, or is that too distant a prospect?
I think unfortunately it's too distant in prospect. America is an empire, and empires will always act as empires regardless of who's elected. If I was president, I would obviously just do the most radical things possible. I'd probably recognize a free Kurdish state, allow for the right of return of Armenians to Turkey, because America is able to exert this pressure, and it can if it wants. I would I'd probably pursue the most radical policies possible. Okay, so that being said, what is a more realistic thing that can be done, right? Well, I think as I mentioned before, I'm really big in terms of doing research and writing on Armenia. There is a pretty big because there's a significant Armenian population in the United States,
Mhm.
especially as we all know in Los Angeles, and the Armenian population really punches above its weight and exerts influence. I think that's one way to go about it. I know it's kind of a funny tangent to go on, but really,
Sure.
if it comes to the right of return of Armenians, a lot Armenians are have done well in the United States. They have a lot of power. They have a lot of money, right? A lot of hardship too, of course, as a people have faced genocide. But I think that's one way to go about it. These administrations will not act on their own. They do need the pressure, and I think what the United States could do should that pressure come is, of course, Turkey's a member of NATO, so being able to block arms, being able to put on embargoes and sanctions, depending on what Turkey does, that would probably be a good way to influence things. But that's just not going to happen if, for instance, no one speaks up, because I'll just give a quick example, like think about, and because I know a lot about Armenia, Armenians almost in a way for the American public actually are the perfect victims, because this is not actually even a group of Muslims. This is a group of Christians and one could argue European to a certain extent. I don't know whether Armenians are Asians or Europeans is a debatable question amongst the Armenian community. But these are people who could pass as white, they're Christian. And yet, during both the Biden Harris administration and the Trump administration, for instance, nothing was done about that genocide, because nothing will be done without that pressure. So I think I'll just end on that note, because that's really what we should go about this. Don't expect these administrations to ever do anything from the goodness of their heart. In fact, America is just like Turkey. It does what it does to pursue power, and the only way to stop that is to create our own form of power and try to resist.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Aidan, for joining us today. And I mean, I feel like I put you on the spot a little bit with some hypotheticals, but yeah, as you also reminded us, yeah, quite soberingly, then whatever happens in the upcoming election, we're not likely to see any dramatic changes for the better, but possibly for the worse. Who knows? In American policy, nonetheless, yeah, it's important to keep having these conversations and keeping the realities of what's happening on the ground in the Middle East in sight and in conversation as much as possible. So thank you for joining us today and for sharing your perspective.
Of course, stay hopeful, everyone. You have the power, okay? The question is just how to get organized.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great note to end on. So this has been the Kurdistan Connection with myself, Matt Broomfield. Until the next program, goodbye.